Hello and welcome to Pulse, your podcast delving into all things health innovation, digital and data. Proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm Louise Shaper, and today we are diving into a book that asks the question, can AI fix some of the challenges that are fundamental in healthcare? Now, as George and I discussed on the last show, we are trialling a new format which will enable us to be in your ears on a weekly basis. One episode will feature George and I doing our take on the hot topics of the day. The following week will feature a deep dive into a topic with a guest interview. We just love having our friends of Pulse on the show, and I'm thrilled to be bringing you today's interview. This episode has been in the works for, I think, more than 6 months, and I promise you will love it. George and I are joined in the studio by Dr Charlotte Blease, where we do a deep dive into her newly released book, Dr Bot: Why Doctors Can Fail Us and How AI Could Save Lives. Charlotte's book is a revelation in the way that she writes so accessibly while she takes an anthropological and definitely a psychological lens to the very nature of the primary care patient consultation. She calls out the challenges of this very fundamental part of the patient journey and how AI could help improve outcomes for clinicians and patients. Now, she does this by refusing to pretend that all is okay in the way that we do it now, saying that clinicians deserve better. As I read her book, and I must thank her publisher, Yale University Press, for the advanced copy, so as I read it, I found myself madly highlighting entire paragraphs and writing many notes. I read Charlotte's work as her almost like a love letter to the professions of medicine, and I really think her work deserves to be read widely. Now, to that end, listeners to Pulse can go into the draw to win a copy of Dr Bot. We've got a few copies to give away, and all you need to do is rate the pod, write a review in your podcast app of choice, and send us a screenshot of your review. Send it to us on email to pulsepod@pulseit.news, and you'll go into the draw to win one of the copies we're going to give away. Dr Bot is released in Australia on the 11th October, and you can pre-order it. We have many listeners in so many countries, so for those of you outside of Australia, good news, it's probably out where you are now. So without further ado, let's go. Today on Pulse, we are joined in the studio by Dr Charlotte Blease, the author of the newly released book, Dr Bot: Why Doctors Can Fail Us and How AI Could Save Lives. This excellent book is the culmination of Charlotte's storied career over decades at the intersection of AI, healthcare, and patient care. She is Associate Professor in Health Informatics at Uppsala University in Sweden and a researcher in Digital Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School in the United States. At the beginning of Dr Bot, Charlotte states, and I quote, "The aim of Dr Bot is to foster a thoughtful conversation about the past and future of medicine." Well, I certainly hope that our chat here today serves to assist in that goal. Charlotte, congratulations on the book and welcome to the Pulse Pod studio.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Charlotte.
Now, thank you for writing Dr. Book, Charlotte. This is an incredible achievement. The book is so well researched and referenced. I think I counted over 800 references, and yet it really is a really easy read. You write with so much empathy, some humor, and it's a narrative that you take the reader on this journey. And I really love that you look at our health system with a very anthropological lens. Well, that's what it seemed like to me. So, really wanting to understand the psychological and the physical challenges and constraints of traditional primary care consultations and the role that technology, specifically AI-enabled tools, can play in addressing some of those shortcomings. That's, let's face it, and all of our listeners know, we have all experienced these shortcomings as patients, and many of us have experienced them as clinicians as well. So for some background, when did you decide to write Dr. Bot? Why the urgency of now? now. And were you worried about taking on the challenge of writing about AI when the field is just not at its beginning, but it's evolving at such breakneck pace? Something that is not really conducive, I imagine, to the timelines of pitching a book, writing it, and getting it released into the wild.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea for the book actually came over 10 years ago, if I'm completely honest. It was around 2013. And I realized I didn't know enough to write the book. So it was a good 10 years in gestation because of the scope of material that I needed to get a grasp on. Originally, the idea was to focus on a kind of psychological profile of the medical appointment and the ways in which things might go wrong. But I realized nobody wants to read a book without some sort of solutions being offered. So it became this sort of split narrative. I purposely structured the book in a way that would be accessible and understandable from a patient and a doctor's perspective, where you're thinking, what is the traditional visit that we all know? And considering from the start of it, you experience symptoms as a patient, you make an appointment, you disclose them, the doctor thinks about what might be wrong with you, the conversation flows in a particular way, and they come up with a diagnosis, the treatment plan, and added into that, there's this sort of the bedside manner. And I wanted to sort of break that down, and the book's broken into 4 parts, considering those sort of psychological challenges that could arise from the patient, the doctor side within a bricks and mortar clinic setting, but also consider what are the potential technological workarounds and are they any good? Doctors are, I think, are deeply underappreciated just how challenging medicine is. And then to consider how good is the technology currently in assisting or in some cases replacing the tasks that doctors have. And can we do things better from the patient's perspective? So the function of medicine is the care of the patient. So the big question is who or what can do that better?
Yeah. And was the focus on the primary care consultation? Because for most healthcare systems, that's sort of where it starts, for the clinician involvement, at least in your care.
Yeah, that's exactly it. As this is sort of gatekeepers. And I think primary care gets such a hard rap because of the encyclopedic knowledge that GPs, primary care physicians need to have and keeping up to date. And they sort of considered as the gatekeepers, or they're not the specialists. But boy, they've got to be a specialist in everything. It's an incredibly tough job.
So the philosophy underpinning Dr. Bott is quite fascinating. You argue that our very humanness, and for that you include the humanness of the clinicians and the patients. And on behalf of the medical community, I do thank you for including us, because often we sort of get a lot of writing which focuses just on the consumer perspective and forgets about the role of the clinicians. You say that the humanness undermines the delivery of healthcare and that AI can improve it. Now, obviously, it's a whole book there with hundreds of pages and lots of references. What brought you to that philosophy that the system of healthcare and outcomes it produces is undermined by human nature, not by data, not by information, not by medical skills?
Yeah, and all of those factors are part of the story as well. But what I wanted to do here, my background is philosophy of mind and science. That was what my PhD was in, theoretical psychology. So I'd read a lot about cognitive science, and I felt that there needed to be an evolutionary psychology lens put into this to basically remind ourselves that doctors and patients, we have these Stone Age minds that are really optimized for an ancestral environment that we're no longer living in. Evolutionary psychologists talk about our minds being shaped by the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. And when you drop a human being into a frenetic modern medical environment where doctors need to keep up to date and they're multitasking, there's a whole buzz of things going on around them, how well do we really do, given that cognitive architecture that we've got? First of all, as I say, and I want to keep saying, is that doctors are doing a staggering job considering that with their expertise. But let's also get real on the human limits of what doctors can do within the environments they're working in, how we can build environments and workarounds that can optimize what we want medicine to do for us. And that's where the technology comes in. We're not optimizing the technology to work with our own human psychology too. And I think that's an issue.
Yeah. And George, have you heard anyone else make this type of argument? Because I thought it was a really fresh and really interesting perspective to look at the very nature of humans and our psychology, and that, yeah, the very nature of how medicine works isn't really well aligned to how humans work and our psychology. I just thought that was a really fresh take.
So it's interesting. If you look at the medical education system, it's so focused on getting information stuffed into doctors' heads. They really do forget the humanity of it. And it's interesting. I mean, here in Australia, a couple of decades ago, we moved from undergraduate medicine to postgraduate medicine with the idea that an older, more experienced student will be able to comprehend some of the vagaries and sort of subtleties of delivering healthcare. But the reality is during that time, the amount of information just quadrupled as well. So we just ended up spending more time putting knowledge into people's heads. And had a couple of discussions with friends over the years about the philosophy of medicine, but it's a lost art. We don't study that anymore in medical school or afterwards. It's sort of something that we refer back to Hippocrates' writings, but then move on and say, how much more data can we jam into the system?
Yeah. And I sympathize as well, because it's easy to say, well, the curriculum should be a bit bigger and we should be doing a bit more to educate doctors. But this always seems to be the panacea, a drop more education. Think, how much more education can people take? It's already a pretty grueling, long process. So I think for understandable reasons, this particular lens hasn't been taken. But I thought it was necessary to think about it this way.
Yeah, no, it's really fabulous. Now, of course, you have written an excellent book and there are lots of examples throughout it. So I thought I'd just ask you about a few in terms of what roles for technology to address some of these challenges in that primary care consultation. So first, under the theme of empathy and patient truth, in one of the chapters, which you've entitled Pouring Our Hearts Out to Machines, you tell a really great story of research done by Warner Slack, who's one of my heroes. So I was thrilled to see that you've referenced Warner. Now, Warner is a complete legend in medical informatics, of course, and his quote, which is, "Any doctor who can be replaced by a machine deserves to be replaced by a machine," is often repeated, but often not attributed to him. And he said that in 1968, I think. Could you tell us about the study that Warner was doing where he was looking at conversational computers talking with patients?
Yeah, so this was a very early study, 1966, and it seems to be one of these studies that's a bit overshadowed in the literature. He was based at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and he had this idea where computers could take medical history. So in other words, get the symptoms from the patient as opposed to the doctor doing it. And he said at the outset of the study, he had this absolute monster computer, giant by today's standards, took up a whole room, called the Link computer. And the idea was that the patient sat in front of it, and it was a sort of a branching logic for allergies, asking various questions that branched into others. It was pre-programmed. And before the study was undertaken, doctors said, this shouldn't be done, or this could be done, but it ought not to be done, and all the rest of it. But he wanted to see what would happen. And he said from the very first interview, he noticed how relaxed the patient was in front of the computer and how uninhibited, and was more comfortable sort of slagging off the computer as well and saying, you asked me that already, but also being quite candid as well. And he said, a patient would never do that with me. So his idea was that, and he wrote about it, and I would say he was like a Martin Luther of medicine, because he sort of nailed his thesis to New England Journal of Medicine. He wrote about it and he said, look, maybe we should have computers taking medical histories as opposed to human doctors. And what I love about this is, first of all, just how irreverent that is and subversive.
Well, even today, let alone in the 1960s.
Absolutely. And we're still thinking about it in that way. And it has been overshadowed. And yet we do have this volume of research which shows patients are more comfortable, particularly for embarrassing symptoms, sensitive symptoms. Symptoms have a certain social sensitivity, like the amount of booze you drink, or drugs you might be taking, embarrassing sexual symptoms, or even sexual orientation, things that just are highly personal, but also cancer red flag symptoms and mental health concerns. And this is where the richness of the evidence supports what Warner Slack recognized, for a range of symptoms, patients are uninhibited if they're in front of a machine, and they feel less judged and less embarrassed, and they can disclose more. So that was, I thought, a really important revelation to remind us of. And that was a medical doctor being a visionary.
Yeah. Oh, I love that story. And as I was reading it, I was like, this is amazing, because you also mentioned Weizenbaum's research as well, and the idea that that scientist really feared when he saw humans willing to be conversationally intimate, not physically intimate, but conversationally intimate with computers. It freaked him out. And he's like, this is dangerous. I need to shut it down. And whereas Warner actually saw real potential for good in that. And, it's a surprising finding even today, let alone back then.
Yeah, and they both hit on the idea at the same time. The experiments were both at the same time, 1966. So it was around 66 to 68. And I think it's fascinating people light on the same idea at the same time, roughly, but also that they had a different impression of it. And I think it's important to take Weizenbaum's perspective seriously too. The idea that we do pour our hearts out to machines, and we might do so, and we might be far too trusting of technology and what we're giving away. But it's a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Warner-Slack's work sort of is exemplary in that regards. And essentially, we've got a couple of psychiatry professors here, Professor Gavin Andrews, Professor Peter Yellowlees, who are both been working in a similar space. They've identified that, especially with mental health issues, that information obtained from a chatbot is actually more accurate than that obtained in a face-to-face interview. One of the other things you note in Dr. Bot is that doctors' knowledge constitutes an astounding feat of human achievement, which I won't disagree with, but it is a hell of a lot of learning. But it's on 1% with many challenges. I mean, just trying to cram it into the curriculum, let alone the ongoing, continuing education that's needed, it's really critical. From your research, how do clinicians stay on top of medical literature now, and how can AI help us there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think it's one of those taboo questions as well, because I don't think doctors are keeping up to date. Now, reading alone, I did a calculation. I looked at PubMed and calculated that there's a new journal article published about every 39 seconds. So I worked back from that and thought, if a doctor was to scan even 2% of these articles, they would spend 22 and a half hours every day doing just that. It doesn't give them a lot of time to actually undertake medicine, sleep, all the rest of it. So it's a staggering amount. And this is where I feel like when psychologists write about human expertise, it's sometimes not, I feel, adequately calibrated to the medical field. So what happens in golf or music or other sports isn't quite the same as the demands that are placed on medical expertise and the ongoing learning that's required. And it's because of this huge treadmill of information that one is expected to keep up to date with.
And it's the culture, isn't it? Those expectations, like they're beyond human. Like no one can do that. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how much free time you have. It's just impossible.
Absolutely. And I think that even as patients, we kind of collude in this idea that doctors should be gods, they should know it all. We want them to be sort of omnicompetent, but they can't be. Oh, and then when doctors write books about medicine, it's often with that theme of, we're only human, we're doing the best that we can. But at the same time, we want our doctor to be confident in their decisions. They've got to make the decisions so rapidly. So the expertise is incredibly difficult to master. And the reading is the entry point into that expertise, but doctors just can't keep up to date. And there's actually not that many articles that are published looking at how much doctors read, but the ones that I was able to look at suggest they are reading less and less. They have much more demands on their time for a variety of reasons, booming patient populations, people living longer with more chronic illness and all the rest of it, and often underfunding in our health system. So yes, it's very challenging.
It's a good point, and I'll give a plug for the product that I've used quite a lot now called openevidence.com, which is something that's come out of the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. So making that information available, because you're right, the challenge is that many years ago when these publications came out in printed version, I would have a stack of journals, many still in their plastic wrappers, sitting by my bedside thinking, okay, tonight before I go to bed, I'm going to read a couple of these. And of course, after an 18-hour day, that wasn't the optimum option. So the new ways of making that information available, we probably need to rethink the way we publish, because because sometimes we publish everything and anything AI. I mean, I use it a lot. I'll often throw an article into an AI tool and say, give me a 3-point summary, because that's what I can comprehend at this stage.
Yeah. And that's quite a good way to use it. But then we get into how good is the AI at summarizing it. I saw a very interesting study that looked at how AI summarized Cochrane reviews. It was criticizing the AI's summation of the reviews, but then embedded later in the article, it said, well, we got humans to summarize the reviews, and they did an even worse job. There was more
Oh, no.
hallucinations in it. So that kind of fine reading that you need to properly summarize something wasn't there with humans either. So
one of the other things that I love about your book, Charlotte, is it is so centrally patient focused, pretty much from the opening page. And you do say at the beginning that you have no dog in the fight for this discussion and this argument you're making, except, of course, for the interests of patients. And George and I are 100% on the same page about that. And I just love that all the way through the book, your arguments are centered around the stories of patients. Now, most of the patient stories seem to be first-hand accounts from individuals you've spoken with, but you also reference a couple of well-known people. Could you tell us how Lisa Marie Presley and Serena Williams made it into your book and what their stories demonstrated?
yeah, so Lisa Marie Presley, she died of a heart attack in January 2023. And there's no evidence of medical misdiagnosis in her case, as far as I'm aware. But what was interesting when you read about it, was pointed out in the press, was her symptoms seemed to be atypical of what we consider a heart attack to look like. So she had abdominal pain and nausea and fatigue, which tend to be more common symptoms among women who suffer from heart attacks than men. So that was an example of how there can be structural biases in admissions, medicine and medical education, partly through the clinical trials that have been run and the body of knowledge that we have. And if you look at medical textbooks, for example, the male body is used 3 times more often than the female body. So you've already got this sort of structural biasing where people are learning what they think is the sort of neutral or typical set of symptoms for some conditions, for example. And we've got to take biological sex differences into account here. It's really important in order to understand at a physiological level, not only the presentation of illness, but also how different treatments work differently in different bodies as well. And that's the case for aging as well. So that was an example of a case whereby there can be those kinds of structural biases and omissions, and how those can have consequences downstream for a doctor potentially making a diagnosis, and also for patients understanding, what am I suffering from? Is it food poisoning? What is it? Is it potentially a risk factor for a heart attack? Serena Williams is interesting too. So back in 2017, she had a C-section, and she has a history of pulmonary embolism. So she was on anticoagulants, but for the C-section, she was taken off them. And she started to recognize this tightness in her chest that was potentially a symptom of something going wrong. But the clinical staff dismissed her concerns. But she was absolutely right. And she said, her renowned tenacity, I need a CT scan now. And she insisted on it. And of course, they did find evidence that she had potentially lethal blood clots. So that was also an example. She's an incredibly wealthy individual, but she'd just given birth. Was there a tendency to think this is a person with baby brain? There was a lot in the press made about racism. And I also look at that as well in the way that there are potential racial differences. People who don't speak English, for example, if you've got an English provider, how these things can exert ripple effects within the visit. So these were examples of the kinds of biases that could potentially kick in, and the sort of stereotyping that may kick in if you're a doctor or a nurse on a ward. But of course, I also want to say, and this is where things get really sticky, a lot of medical expertise relies on quick and dirty biases and a form of stereotyping. So how do you sort out as a doctor the good stereotypes from the bad? Very, very difficult, but no less can affect patients in ways that are well documented now. And those were illustrations of those cases.
It's very interesting. I mean, I remember you reading years ago that back in the last century, clinical trials excluded women because they complicated the evaluation of the data because of hormonal changes. So we had a whole bunch of therapeutics that was tested only on men and then delivered to 50% of the population with no evidence around their effectiveness or safety at all. And you're right. I mean, often you sort of make stereotypical decisions. Sometimes you err too far on the side of caution and then you overdiagnose, but of course, sometimes you err on the side of statistically the chances of it are low, so you miss them. So it's a really challenging area. I think you've really covered it well in those books. And if people like Lisa Marie Presley and Serena Williams can suffer it, then the rest of us have real challenges ahead of us.
Yeah. And I suppose that's the other thing, if we're using AI as well, making sure that the AI, the data that it's learning from is not biased. And there's a huge amount of content about how that can be done, but also how it can be done better in your book as well.
And obviously where you get that data from, because if it's just trawling publicly available sources, there may not be good data. The other big issue, of course, is information asymmetry. I mean, as you commented earlier, we have this expectation that our clinicians are a fountain of knowledge and know everything. And to be honest, the way we're trained in medical school, we're sort of imbibed with that idea and therefore think that we know more than everyone else, whereas she made a very good point. Serena Williams probably knew more about her physiology and her situation than anyone else. But, we still think about Dr. Google and now Dr. Bot. To what degree do patients having access to the same information we have? I used to argue that when I was at medical school, medical journals were locked up in the medical library. You had to be a medical student or a medical professional to get access to that library. Now anyone can read the New England Journal of Medicine or even JAMA. And we've often seen examples where the lay press has taken an article from a journal and typed it up to mean something it doesn't. How do we manage that access to information across the entire sector to make sure that the information that everyone's using is both accurate and valid?
Yeah, it's a great point. So with Google, I don't think we're there at the tipping point with some of these generative AI tools like ChatGPT. I think there was a while when people had internet search engines and some of us didn't know what they were all about and what they could do. And some people got it immediately. And I think we're still at this. We're not yet at that tipping point with generative AI tools and what they can do, although there is increasing adoption, of course. But when it comes to accessible medical information, and I cite this in the book, a range of studies which showed that many doctors are really in favour of patients having access, doing their research and empowering themselves to look at stuff online. But some doctors actually don't like it. And this is where it gets quite interesting because there is this recurrent theme in the literature where doctors feel like it's starting to potentially encroach on their expertise. They get nervous that patients won't quite understand what they read. And then from the patient side, there's an issue where patients are quite aware that they're consulting with an expert. So some patients do, but some don't want to bring up that they saw something online and they don't want to be seen to question their doctor. They don't want the doctor to feel that they're insulting them or that they're sort of encroaching on their turf, so to speak. So there is this subtle dance that goes around this. We might even talk about triadic care here. This idea there's a body of knowledge out there online. Both parties can access it. Doctors Google things too, and they look stuff up, of course, all the time too. But it's the negotiation of presenting that as a patient and being seen to upset the more high status, in this scenario, medical doctor. So how will that pan out when it comes to generative AI? I think that's going to be interesting because many patients will begin to use these tools as a first opinion service. They'll use it as a sort of a triaging service where they'll check up their symptoms and see what they are. Is it worth going? On average, by the way, people take 2 hours out of every day for a 20-minute visit. It's much higher if you're low income. So why would you not use these tools? Well, I think people will be doing that. They may then want to say to the doctor, look, this is why the ChatGPT or DeepSeek or whatever it is telling me this. The doctor ought to be interested at that point and wonder, I think it would be interesting if there was a scenario where the doctor could say, do you want to go through this together and use this tool together?
Yeah. Danny Sands talks about that a lot, doesn't he? Dr. Danny Sands, who is e-patient Dave's doctor, how it's real collaboration. Yeah, bring me the information. Let's go through it together. Yeah.
Adam Rodman talks about this too, of this idea, do you want us to use it? Now, here's the issue. We need to have medical grade tools, and it's great to have a doctor's oversight, but we need to ensure that the privacy is preserved as well with the patient. So, yes, I think that there are subtleties that arise when you bring in this kind of information on how that could potentially pan out for the visit. And how we negotiate that will be very interesting to see what the medical community wants to do with that. But patients are using these tools. And let's face it, and I've done surveys on this, doctors are using these tools too.
Absolutely. It's a great point. And to be honest, from a physician's perspective, having an intellectual discussion with a patient around their disease and what's happening in the management of it is actually quite fulfilling. The problem, of course, is that the way our medical practices are funded, we have 12 minutes with a patient. We need to get them in, diagnosed, treatment plan, and shipped out because there's 30 other people waiting in the waiting rooms. The reason most doctors go into medicine is that they really enjoy that intellectual challenge of making diagnostic decisions. When I first met Louise was in 2004 at the MedInfo in San Francisco, and I had the pleasure then to meet Dr. Tom Ferguson, who was the first e-patient doctor around. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years after. But like you point out, these aren't necessarily new ideas. The new tools now give us an opportunity to do more with them than we could in the past.
Yeah. And the other thing too about using these tools is patients tend to be better at using these tools too. They know there's limits on their own expertise. And I think that's sometimes underappreciated, where we all know sometimes you look on Google and everything seems to point to cancer. But at the same time, what we're doing is we're aware of that as well. That's sort of cyberchondria, as people call it. And actually there's studies that show even so-called digital immigrants, so people who weren't born with the era of the internet, they're also aware of these limitations too. And actually still patients want the doctor to get the final say. Increasingly, they want the AI and these tools in the loop, but they do still want the doctor to have the say.
Okay, time for a quick break, but in a moment, we'll be back with more from Charlotte Blease and Dr. Bott. In the second half of the interview, we ask, is it realistic to think that we can remodel healthcare around the patient? We get into surveillance capitalism, big tech and regulation, and more on how the culture of medicine fails clinicians as well as patients. Don't go anywhere. Now, you also say in the book that we should rationally remodel medicine, and George and I love talking about changing the business models of healthcare because, the traditional models and the resistance to change them is really what holds us back so much. But you do talk about rationally remodeling medicine, so giving it an upgrade, and you say that it should be patients who should get the final word. So how confident are you that this is actually going to happen, where the patient voice isn't just a token in the room, but we truly have a health system that's centered around their needs and designed to improve their outcomes? Because we're talking wholesale changes here. It's not insignificant.
No, I tend to be an optimist about things. I think that, you look at the history of medicine. It's one of mankind's greatest achievements. And I think things do get better, but incrementally. And we have a tendency to want them to change quickly, especially when we feel like we can see the solution or the answer. So I would be confident that things are going to change in the sense that it's going to be harder and harder to ignore the voice of patients, because technology is empowering patients in a way that is very hard to deny. And the fact of the matter is it's empowering doctors as well, not just for your ambient AI tool that's helping you with your documentation, but in terms of even as a diagnostic tool and as a support. So I think that I'm confident things will change, but probably not as quickly as we might want. And that might be in some ways a good thing, because it's easy to criticize medicine as an institution as being too conservative. And doubtless there have been occasions in the history of medicine where the medical community hasn't seen the benefit of innovation. Antiseptics, hand washing, anesthesia. There's some really interesting cases, but AI is one of those cases, I think, where we will be embracing it, but there's right to have a steadiness about how to do it and it's to put the brakes on in certain scenarios. The issue here is, perhaps we'll get into it, it's already here. Patients are already using it. We've done the largest scale surveys on this. In fact, in the UK, 1,000 GPs in 2024, 20% said they were using tools like ChatGPT for clinical tasks. I did it again in January this year. 25% said they were using it for clinical tasks. We've got to talk more about that. So there is this change happening, and I don't have a crystal ball. I don't want to get into the whole forecasting business, but I'm optimistic that the patient will be inserting themselves at the center of this. But the trade-off, of course, is with the technology and how big tech companies are taking our data and exploiting us. So, which is a whole other area.
Well, it's funny you said that, Charlotte, because big tech, as you point out in your book, and we're very aware that they've pretty much perfected surveillance capitalism. And we have gladly given our data over for exploitation. We all know that if we're not paying for it, we are the product. What can be done about this in healthcare? Is regulation the fix? Because, you've got EU charging ahead with quite significant regulation, which is great, but then they're getting accused of it's harming innovation. The US just legislated that AI is not able to be regulated for 10 years, which also seems like a pretty stupid idea. In Australia, we're not really doing anything about this yet. We're talking about it rather than doing anything. But Australia is actually leading the world in regulating social media access for children. So as of December 2025, if you're under 16, you're not able to access social media. So what do we do about this in health? What do you think?
It's a huge question, and I'm going to be candid. It's not one that I deal with in the book and in my research. What I'm trying to do is say, what would be the justification for AI in healthcare? And I look at it from a psychological justification of the actors involved and the benefits, but also the risks. But I do say at the end of the book, look, there's an ecosystem here. There are other arguments for and against technology that I'm not dealing with. There's the environmental offset. There's the idea of what's the point in having all of these tools if people don't have running water or access to medications anyway. And there's the trade-off with, as you say, surveillance capitalism and the fact that when we use these, when we're online, we are the product. If we can't see what's being sold to us, it's us that is the product. So what's interesting is, and again, we can put a psychological lens onto that, is that we intellectually know that that's the case when we go online. We know it when we do our searches and our questions with tools like ChatGPT as well. But we don't think of it as some predator because, again, we're not psychologically equipped in that sense to perceive a predator or to perceive we're being cheated in some sense, that there's a transaction going on because of how our minds have evolved. So again, we can intellectualize it, but we still don't really see is this a trust base, what's going on. And the result is we are indeed potentially being exploited. My opinion on it is that we need more regulation. But of course, in a way, how do you get that sweet spot? I leave that for health policy and lawyers to take a deep dive into. But I think privacy has probably gone. It's what then happens with our information downstream, who it's being sold to. Are we being exploited in a way that is highly discriminatory? What are the consequences? And that's where regulators and policymakers need to have teeth in the regulations in order to exert meaningful penalties on big tech. And they've also got to be able to survey what big tech is doing and where these violations occur. In the EU is interesting. So the EU's AI Act was implemented in February, but it's still not clear how it's being interpreted on the ground and what's actually really going to happen. And are we safer as patients? It's quite unclear. What's interesting too is we could talk about the policy side of things and the regulation, but again, what could the medical community be doing? Even if you look at education, of course, I've said that we can't just keep going back to education as a cure-all. But at the same time, doctors do need to be trained in when they can use these tools, just simple matters of fact like that and the risks of them. And medical curricula in North America and in the UK still don't mention AI, machine learning, very basically within the requirements for graduate education. And that's staggering in the 21st century that we're sticking our heads in stethoscopes in the sand about this. Like, we really need to do our due diligence in the medical community side as well.
Regulating AI, which is moving so quickly, is very challenging. But of course, then we always have the legal system, which kicks in as well, in which case you get class action suits against people doing things in certain ways. So, and we still haven't worked out how that all fits in, because an AI tool is only as good as the first legal case against it, which bankrupts the people who use it. So we need to think about how regulation can protect people using it, but also support them. It's definitely an interesting challenge, and I think it'll be work for scholars for many years to go. The other thing you do celebrate within your writing doctors' expertise and their dedication. And again, I thanked you for it before, and I'll thank you for it again, because that decision to become a medical doctor is challenging and sustaining a career. And I was just speaking yesterday with a colleague of mine whose father is still in general practice at the age of 83 and still has people lined up outside his door because he practices an old school type of medicine, which they want. But you also haven't been shy about calling out the failings of the healthcare system. How are you hoping that by reading or referencing Dr. Bott, the culture of medicine can be changed so that we can actually think about things in a different way about the way we deliver care?
I think my ambition for the book is even just to start a conversation. God forbid if I could change the culture of medicine, that would be some miracle. But I wouldn't be that grandiose in my claims. But what I would say is I would hope we could start a debate, just a debate about some rather taboo conversations. I mean, even take the example, it's quite hard if you're not a medical doctor in a medical school to be taken seriously. And yet there are ways in which you can be an expert in medicine that doesn't involve a medical training, whether you're a historian or thinking about psychology of the appointment or medical ethics, whatever, or medical law. So if I could start a conversation about the psychology of the appointment, the challenges. And I'm really happy that you saw the point. The big point here that I do want to get across is that, as I've said, it's a staggering achievement that doctors are able to do this. I think we're going to look back and say, my God, how did humans manage to do those things? And how did they do it so successfully, given the pressures on them? And in fact, we do need to think about the actual victimhood in some sense of doctors too, the depression, the suicide rates, all the rest of it, because there's serious issues there. But if I could open up a conversation about the fact there is this sort of, within medical literature, memoirs written by doctors. I've read an awful lot of these memoirs, going back many years now, and they do have this same sort of underlying grammar, which is, I'm a doctor, but I'm only human. But there is this sort of strand of, but I am a hero. And there is this sort of attitude, it's sort of almost like a medical sob story. We're great at what we do. And yes, doctors are great at what they do. But if we can move away from that kind of characterization to say, look, there's a conversation about, because these books don't tend to overly focus on the errors for good reason. But let's talk more seriously. But we also don't want to have this sort of combative, the patient side, the doctor, there's my story and the doctor did everything. We need that to some extent, but we also just need to have a grown-up story about why does this happen, that things go wrong, and without the blame other than let's consider the architecture of the human mind and limitations of it. And then we can get a bit more sensible about what can we hope to do about this.
So it's interesting. So back in 1999, when the Institute of Medicine to Aries Human Report came out, we got a very sort of confrontational perspective. If you look at the IOM report, it doesn't say that doctors killed 900,000 people. But then when you look at the lay press, there was like not doctors killed 900,000 people. So understanding that often we're making decisions that are 49-51. You can't, there's not certainty in medicine. So I think you've done a great job in putting that. But I think you are helping to nudge that culture to think about it more completely than just a success failure model.
I agree, George. And it really came across in the book as well. It almost love letter in a way to medicine and really understanding the pressures that clinicians do have on them on pretty much a daily basis. But then why do we put them, and this is a question George and I often ask on the pod, why do we put clinicians in situations that aren't designed for them to operate at their best? I remember when I was studying occupational therapy, so I was that baby, knew nothing, and one of my girlfriends from OT was dating a doctor. So I all of a sudden I was hanging out with medical students, future doctors. And when they talked about what was happening, like it blew my mind. It had never occurred to me that if I got rushed to ED, that they're in the middle of a 15-hour shift and, some of them have only got 3 hours sleep the night before. I would have thought, if anything, I mean, it's a very naive perspective, I now understand, but I would have thought, God, if anything, when I show up, especially when there's an emergency, I want someone who's only doing a 6-hour shift. They're well rested, they're hydrated, they've eaten, they can perform at their best. And yet we put them in these situations and then we're not allowed to talk about, and doctors especially are not allowed to put out their hands and say, hey, this is shit. This is not good for me. It's not good for the profession. Like they sort of have to be like more than heroes, but gods, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, there is this sort of dual track. We want doctors to be, as you say, godlike and all the rest of it. But then there's the recognition we are only human. And it's I suppose what I'm trying to do with the book is occupy that space and say, well, we recognize they're not gods and they are only human. So let's talk about that in a more detailed way. I mean, is it 300 to 400 doctors kill themselves? Yeah, die each year from suicide. That's a whole medical graduating class in the US. And it's the level of burnout in the UK. It's 4 in 10 doctors. I think it was the latest poll just say that they don't have the capacity to work at the level. And I think that's quite low actually, considering what they have to do. That's UK GPs, but yeah, it's.
One of the things we're seeing here in Australia is a lot of young doctors leaving the system. So they do their medical training, they spend a couple of years in the hospital, and because of the struggles, and it's been well documented here that junior doctors have a pretty hard life, they pack their bags and go and do something else. And that causes two challenges. One, we lose a well-educated workforce. And two, it means that those who are left behind are basically carrying the burden because the planning was all done around we're graduating 1,000 doctors and they don't all hang around. And then the other issue is the rest of the healthcare workforce. I mean, nurses, allied health workers, psychologists, people who interact more with the system. So again, the changing of the way it's delivered. But ultimately, as we've seen with the UK, the NHS only has so many pounds it can spend, and we have the same challenge here in Australia. And we tend to get that two-tier system that those who have money can get a better care system than those who don't.
Yeah, it's
a challenge. Yeah.
So, look, it seems that every second day, some prominent person, whether it might be Bill Gates or someone, is stating that doctors are going to be replaced by AI. But of course, we're not cynics, but we are very aware that we're at the early stage of this hype cycle. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this stage of things. But what do you say to people who do invariably push back on the proposition that AI is going to save medicine? But then on the other hand, you've got the people who push back and say that AI won't substantially change medicine at all. I don't think either of those extreme positions are the correct one. So what do you say to those people?
Yeah, I always come back to this idea of Amara's law, which is the idea that people tend to overestimate what technology is going to do in the short term and underestimate what it'll do in the longer term. So we say, I think the change, going back to, will be more incremental than we imagine. But I think that it's a trajectory where the technology we've got today is the worst it'll ever be. And whereas the human mind doesn't evolve that quickly. So we're still stuck with a sort of Pleistocene brains, but which we can do an enormous amount with enculturation and all the rest of education. But I think that there will be increasing adoption of technology. And I go back to Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma back in 1997, I think. And actually, Richard and Daniel Susskind, they wrote a book, The Future of the Professions, that I found an incredibly important book. 2015, I think there's been a second edition of that book. But they basically take up the same idea as Christensen, which is the idea that there's sort of two phases when it comes to technology. There's an automation phase, is the Susskind's language, where tasks tend to be delivered by the tasks that we currently have in a particular job. So take the example of documentation in medicine. Doctors absolutely hate doing this. And the idea being that the technology can undertake this task. It just becomes automated. But then there's another phase that they discuss, which is the innovation phase, and sometimes described as a disruptive phase. But this is where you're undertaking the task in a radically different way from where they've been undertaken traditionally by humans in a particular domain. And this is where it may look nothing like what we currently have. Christensen goes back to the idea of Netflix. I think this is a nice example whereby we of a certain vintage remember going into video stores and renting wasn't a DVD, it was a video. Incidentally, I remember being in the ones in Sydney and thinking they were the best video stores I'd ever seen in my life.
I do miss video stores. They were fun, lovely places.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of arguments with my sister in them. We were pacing up and down, which one are we going to get? But the idea was that, so you take that model as a blockbuster model, and then the automation phase was this idea of, look, we could be renting these by mail order. That means you have a vast trove, or you give more people options of what they can rent. Movie buffs get a better selection, and it's an easier, more convenient process in some sense. You post it off. But then, of course, on Netflix, incidentally, that was their model for about a year, mail order. But then we all know how the story ended. We have nothing like what you have as a blockbuster. We now, at the click of a switch, we have all the options, the algorithms give us their advice on what other people like. It's a completely different model. That's what I would subscribe to is going to happen here. The time frame, I would never put it, I don't know, because there's so many interlocking interests here as well, from the medical professional side as well, but also the AI side and, of course, the health policy side. But I think ultimately we will see a radical overhaul of how medicine is delivered in the future.
One of the areas we haven't really looked at in detail and I think is really important is research. I mean, there's a lot of research, there's medical research, and we've talked about the volumes and volumes of research, but then we see a lot of the AI research, which uses a different metric. It talks about areas under the curve. It talks about, diagnostic accuracy, but using predefined vignettes of clinical information. And the reality is one of the big skills in medicine is getting the right information from the patient in a proper way. So that the medical history taking is an art in itself. And Abraham Verghese from Stanford often talks about the therapeutic value of talking to the patient about their history rather than just capturing the information. Where are we now in tying AI research and health research and focusing on outcomes, clinical outcomes? So does having a 25% more accurate diagnosis actually affect the outcome? Does it mean that things are different? And we had this discussion many years ago in oncology. Now that we can diagnose cancers early, we tend to think, okay, we give people a longer lifespan. But in actual fact, in many cases, all we do is give them more years with cancer rather than statistically better outcome. What's your thoughts around what needs to be done in this research space?
That's a really big question. I think it depends on the patient population too. So let's take the example of rare diseases. And this is where I think AI could make a vast difference. There's something like 7,000 rare diseases. And apparently these are growing by about 250 every year. Now, if you're a GP, somebody presents with a bunch of symptoms. Very often these symptoms can present early on as tiredness, aches and pains or whatever. And doctors might not know what to do with this. You've also got the issue with rare diseases instantly, where it depends where you live in the world, what's classified as rare. So you've got this added challenge of classification systems and also the prevalence. So for example, cystic fibrosis is a hotspot in Ireland for that, but not sickle cell. You go to Nigeria, it's like 1 in 50 births or something. Bit less common in America, but in Europe, it would be classified as rare. So you've got all those layers of challenges that make it hard as a doctor to navigate. And I didn't write about it extensively in my book, but I have 2 siblings. I've got a twin sister with myotonic muscular dystrophy and an older brother with this condition. And in my brother's case, it took about 20 years for him to get a diagnosis. And he didn't know what was wrong. And he got it through my sister, who chanced on getting a locum, who, as soon as she walked into the room, knew what it was. So you've got that sort of a lottery thing of a doctor might have read about it or has maybe seen a few people or whatever when you're dealing with rare illnesses. And I think this is where AI could make a significant difference for patients and shorten that diagnostic journey or odyssey in the sense that the patients have. I looked at studies in Europe, and something like 22 million people in Europe are living with a rare illness. Million waits something like on average 10 years. Now, like you might say, even those studies how do we accurately know? But that's where I think it depends on the patient population. I think you're asking a really interesting question too, but what do we value in medicine? Do we think it should be about living longer and more precision when we can't do anything with it? Very important questions to get into. But for some patients, I think this will be a game changer.
If it's a trigger for your next book, let me know. I think it's something we should really discuss in the future.
Well, your book poses questions that are more than just about the future of healthcare and technology's role in it, as our conversation has demonstrated hopefully today. But it's really about the kind of society and the kind of world that we want to live in, and what do we need to be building for now. So I know you said earlier that you don't like the idea of having a crystal ball and knowing exactly when things are happening. So let's just say X number of years. If we fast forward those X number of years, and the warnings and the inspiration in your Dr. Bot book have all been heeded, everyone paid attention, and they're like, Charlotte's right, we need to do something about this, and changes are made. How will the structure, practice, and the systems of healthcare be different in that future?
Wow, you're really putting me on the spot with this one. I think what we'll get, I'll again be somewhat vague, and I think what we will have in the future will be a health delivery system. If everything goes according to, if you like, the plan, everybody's read my book. Yes, it becomes a bestseller and all the rest of it. But what would happen is healthcare, I think, would be delivered more fairly. It would be much more accessible. Patients would have more knowledge about conditions. I think it would be fairer. And it would also be a case where people felt that the human side of care was delivered in a less hurried manner, that they felt they had the support as a patient throughout their journey. Now, the key question is, how then do you get at that? And I signal within the book what that might look like in various ways. But I can foresee a time when, for example, it could be that you have some sort of avatar situation. You have a person that you can consult with in terms of asking health related questions. This might be bespoke in a way that looks like you, or is created in your image in some sense, but could be this guide on the side. And it could be that preventative care is a key part of this as well. So giving advice, it's able to discern, have you left the house in 2 days? How much physical activity have you had? What's your calorific intake? Blah, blah. So it could be giving advice like that, but also it could be that we still have health systems insofar as we're going to still need operations. We're still going to need to be treated. And I think in that sense, the personnel that make up health systems will change a bit. At the back end, I think there's going to be sort of the color of the future is going to be the hoodie when it comes to the algorithms that are involved in care. I think there'll be more robotics in surgery. So we're going to need these new professions, people who are data knowledge experts within medicine. They know how to curate evidence. We're going to have people involved in ethical oversight in terms of the fairness of algorithms, how they can be optimized and all the rest of it. So I think there's going to be a range of other jobs in the middle term as well, in the longer term, in relation to the adequacy of these tools. But, it's a hard question to get to exactly sort of put into a vision in a sense, because the devil's in the detail of the particulars at every stage with technology. But I suppose what I would end on is the idea that I think people will look back at what we've got today as being where a patient feels symptoms, physically goes to a doctor, even if they're ill or have got disabilities or elderly, and they going to look back and think, my gosh, that was a terrible way to do things. But they'll also look back and think it was quite quaint in a way, but they'll also be quite queasy about it. They'll think, God, how the hell did people manage in those systems? And they'll say, but it was amazing that they did. But they'll also feel a certain nervousness in the pit of their stomach. So I think more people will get fairer access to diagnostic decision making in the future. Does that necessarily mean public health will be better? That's a whole other equation.
Yeah, that could be the topic of your next book. Focus on public health.
10 years' time, yes.
Well, Charlotte, thank you so much for all the time and effort in the 10 years gestation that you put into writing Dr. Bot. Obviously, George and I thoroughly recommend it to all of our listeners, and we certainly hope it becomes a bestseller because it deserves to be. The way that you write, as I said, is very accessible. The extent of the research and, in some ways, the bombardment of evidence. We can't go on continuing to ignore this evidence. We know it to be true. There's increasing evidence that we need to change things. And I certainly hope that Dr. Bot does facilitate some of these changes by raising awareness of these issues, but giving people permission to talk about them and giving people permission to actually go, well, hang on, I have a role to play. What can I do that's going to be different and impact people on a day-to-day basis? So, and again, thank you for joining us in the studio today.
It's been a real pleasure.
I have to join Louise. I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation and the book's fantastic. I literally sat down for 3 days straight to finish reading it. And I think it's a real opportunity to think about things differently. And it's great that it's not coming from someone embedded in the sector. This is not a doctor writing about the thing, nor is it a consumer advocate. It's someone who's looking at it from a much broader perspective. I hope we have the opportunity to see you down under at some stage. I think there would be some great discussions to be had here. I really thank you for really what was a extremely intellectually stimulating conversation.
I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
We trust you enjoyed our chat with Dr. Charlotte Blease. There is so much to learn from Charlotte's take, and you can read about all the things we didn't ask by getting your hands on a copy of Dr. Bot. If you'd like a copy of Dr. Bot on us, don't forget to write a review of the pod in your favourite podcast app and send us a screenshot of your review via email to pulsepod@pulseit.news. Dr. Bot is out in Australia on the 11th of October and available in other countries now. Thank you for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Big thanks to everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe, follow, and rate us. Please, please, please don't forget to do that. It's super important. Just do it wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, you can visit pulseit.news to sign up for the e-newsletter and explore Pulse IT's massive digital archive. Send any feedback or topic suggestions to George and I via email on pulsepod@pulseit.news. We always love to hear from you. Have a great day, everyone.